I will be reading the story of a woman who is asked to be called by the initials MS for this video. She's one of the people who filed complaints with the American Psychiatric Association's ethics department because of the harm she suffered from being diagnosed with labels from their manual, which is known as the DSM. All of the complaints were summarily dismissed without consideration of their merits. Here is her story. She says, "In 2008, I endured a period in which I had major life changes: a move, the life-threatening illness of my mother, marital strife, isolation from friends, and months of unexplained physical pain that medications and therapy had not reduced. At this time, I also began menopause, and that caused me concern about aging. As a result, I experienced mood changes, downheartedness and sadness, severe anxiety, and eventually insomnia. I sought counseling from a psychiatrist because I previously found counseling very helpful during rough times. Though I specifically stated that I wanted to work through my psychological difficulties without drugs, my psychiatrist convinced me to consider medication. Once a person is diagnosed with a psychiatric label, it's highly likely that psychotropic drugs will be prescribed. The doctor suggested that an antidepressant might make it easier to deal with my various difficulties. So I agreed. I was suffering enough, so that's why I agreed. I later attended a medication management session in which a more senior psychiatrist was brought in to assess my condition before the prescription was written. I tend to be very energetic and a fast talker, which is apparently why this psychiatrist suggested I might have bipolar II disorder. I was very frightened about what was happening to me, but the listing for the bipolar II disorder in the psychiatric manual, the DSM, doesn't require the therapist to investigate the reasons for the behavior. I stated that I strongly doubted that I had bipolar II disorder, and I said I was panicky and downhearted. So the psychiatrist prescribed the antidepressant tofranil. When I took the tofranil, I became more agitated, had some strange Tourette's-like symptoms, and started acting in bizarre ways. As a result, I wound up in the psychiatric emergency room. I told my regular psychiatrist I couldn't function anymore, so she suggested I go into hospital for a few days to get a closer look at what was going on. I spent 1 week in a psychiatric hospital, where I reiterated to a different psychiatrist that I was feeling sad and downhearted due to the still chronic, debilitating physical pain and my severe anxieties about aging, my mother, and unhappiness with life in general. He diagnosed me with major depressive disorder and prescribed a different antidepressant, Remeron. That drug made me feel even more agitated than before I entered the hospital, and later also gave me Tourette-like symptoms. So the hospital psychiatrist added Klonopin to my regimen. I still didn't want to be on any drugs, and I wanted to find someone who could help me work through my personal problems. So after leaving the hospital, I sought yet another psychiatrist to help me taper off the drugs. Instead, she diagnosed me with bipolar II disorder and told me I was in denial when I objected to the diagnosis. At a later meeting, she told me that talk therapy was not going to help me, it would do me no good because I was sick. I now understand that it's commonly assumed that if one has a psychiatric label, only medical treatments will help. After briefly trying several different medications unsuccessfully, the psychiatrist ultimately put me on a high dose of the antipsychotic, really neuroleptic drug Zyprexa, and within about a week I was back in the ER with a bad reaction to the drug. I had severely stiff muscles, confusion, compromised short-term memory, and I still felt no better psychologically. Throughout all this, both my husband and I insisted that these were wrong diagnoses, but because of my being stimulated by antidepressants, which have been shown to have stimulant effects, doctors didn't want to listen. MS goes on to say, "Fortunately, the head of psychiatry at the hospital where I spent the night after the Zyprexa overdose suggested that nutritional therapies might help. I soon found out that I indeed had many nutritional problems, including very low vitamin B12, which can sometimes cause symptoms that are labeled as psychiatric disorders. Once I started various nutritional therapies and found another talk therapist who was compassionate and took the time to understand my personal problems that had been called bipolar II disorder, I made rapid progress. My new psychotherapist's approach was eclectic, but based primarily on cognitive behavior therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. Most importantly, she helped me rebuild my sense of self as someone with inner resources, says MS. Both she and the holistic psychiatrist agreed that I was not bipolar after all. Today, I am free of drugs and psychological symptoms. MS says, prior to this successful treatment, I was diagnosed with allegedly psychiatric illnesses with no other causes of my difficulties being considered. The DSM listings do not warn against this omission. Life problems that could easily explain what I was feeling need not be ruled out in order to classify me as mentally ill. I was quickly slapped with labels based on categories that are not scientifically based and thus can be easily applied to ordinary problems in living, mistaking them for signs of an alleged defective brain or chemical imbalance. MS says, had I not fought these alarming diagnoses, I might still today believe them to be accurate. I might never have discovered several underlying, easily correctable physical reasons for some of my symptoms. I might never have addressed the problems in living that paralyzed me. And I might still be taking some sort of unnecessary, debilitating, and very risky drug. MS says, some of the most compelling evidence that I did not have a mental disorder is that now, doing nothing that would be recommended for someone so afflicted, I feel fine and balanced. I am productive at work, and I have positive social interactions. Any feelings of anxiety or sadness that I experience are situation-related and fleeting. As a result of receiving these diagnoses, MS suffered many kinds of harm that she says would not have occurred if the diagnosis given to her didn't supposedly carry the weight of being scientifically grounded, serious mental illnesses. Here are the losses she says she incurred. She says, I was put on drugs that had serious negative effects, including a narrowly averted possible case of neuroleptic malignant syndrome. In addition to the effects already noted, the Remeron clouded my thinking and verbal ability, and the Zyprexa made my muscles so stiff I could not type or hold a pen to write. Both of these problems restricted my ability to do professional work and engage in the ordinary tasks of living. The reason the negative drug effects were so late in being diagnosed as drug-caused was that I had been diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, she says. Thus, the drug effects were misinterpreted as signs of my supposed mental disorders. Because of getting the bipolar II diagnosis, she was not helped to deal with the real causes of her initial upset. She says that often happens when a psychiatric diagnosis is given because the diagnosis implies that the upset is caused by a broken brain or a chemical imbalance. She says, I was stripped of a sense that I was a person who could heal through my own agency. Being diagnosed made me feel I was defective and helpless, the worst possible framing for someone undergoing a personal crisis. And finally, she says, the diagnoses of major depressive disorder and bipolar II disorder remain in my medical records and thus will continue to follow me. Thank you for listening to her story.